We have a friend who's an Army chaplain, and he recently shared that on average, families experience a minor crisis every 6 weeks and a major crisis every 6 months, which can really only mean one thing. Well, hello friends, I'm Mary Beth with At What Cost, where simple living and deep faith go hand in hand. So what is that one thing that this means? Well, it means that you're either in one or you're about to be. If families experience one minor crisis every 6 weeks and one major crisis every 6 months, if you do the math, that is approximately 10 crises a year, which kind of boils down to like once a month. Now, for some of you, a lot of things may be falling into place. And that's just the average. I know many of you have been kind of following along with our experience of one sort of major crisis every week, which, let me tell you, is getting a little old. So what does this have to do with family minimalism, simple living, and more importantly, our faith? I'm glad you asked, and so soon in the video too. I mean, you're really looking for the value right up front. Good job. The short answer is it's important that we consider both the role that our stuff plays during those moments of crisis and how our faith impact our response to them. That's the short answer, but I know you came here for the long answer, so let's dive in. First off, let's look at what a crisis is, or at least how it comes about. What makes for a crisis? Now, I found a great resource from Head Start, and I will link it in the description below. So they list here that a family is thrust into crisis when two or more elements contributing to the state of a crisis interact. So what are those elements? Well, first we have experiencing a stress. So this is really kind of producing the situation. The second is having a difficult time coping. The third is showing chronic difficulty meeting basic family responsibilities and having no apparent source of support. Now, before you listen to those elements and count yourself out of the typical 10 crises a year, these probably occur more frequently than you would like to imagine. At least they did for me. Reading this list was kind of an eye-opener. We are all faced with stressful situations all the time. They become a crisis when two or more of those elements interact. So how does that kind of play out? Let's look at a few examples. For example, we have a stressful situation and we also have a difficult time coping. Now let's look at the definition for coping because I think it's important. Coping means that you're able to adjust to the demands of a situation that is very atypical to your regular experience. Or maybe you're having a difficult time meeting your family's needs. And this isn't just like the occasional realizing it's 5:30 and you have nothing planned for dinner. If you have been in the midst of crisis and had a difficult time taking care of your family's basic responsibilities, you know what I mean. What about having no apparent sources of support? Now, there are very real situations that you may find yourself in where having a support system is difficult. There's actually something that I think a lot of us face more frequently in that idea of not having an adequate support system, and that is feelings of isolation. And not just because of the extreme social distancing we have all been facing. This is really the mindset that our circumstances are so unique, they are so overwhelming that no one could possibly understand what we are going through. And yes, all of our circumstances are somewhat unique, and people may have a difficult time relating to your specific set of circumstances. But overall, this is sort of a lie we tell ourselves, that no one could possibly understand what I'm going through. The circumstances may be unique, but the feelings that they produce of stress, anxiety, depression, anger, overwhelm, confusion, We all face those things, and we can find common ground with one another there. Don't believe the lie that you really are the only one who's ever experienced this. It just brings us into isolation and further throws us into the crisis. So now that we understand what a crisis is, what does it have to do with minimalism? Because that's what this channel is really all about, right? When I was reading about these 4 elements, it brought to mind a lot of those same old feelings that I had when we had way too much stuff. The dishes constantly being dirty, the constant flow of laundry, the piles of papers, the feelings of inadequacy. It was all very stress producing. I have to manage all of this stuff. And even in the moments when I am able to manage all of it, just being confronted oftentimes with the sheer weight of what we had in our home, it was very stress producing. You see where I'm going with this? We have this low level of stress that's already present because of all of the stuff that we have. We throw in a few feelings of isolation or not being able to regularly cook for our families, clean our homes, do these kinds of regular responsibilities, and before long, we find ourselves in a crisis, whether or not there has been some cataclysmic event or not. And I kind of think this is where the meme about feeling like you are losing a game of Jumanji in your home happens. Before we know it, with every turn of events that happens, whether it's big or small or major or minor, things seem to get more and more and more out of control. Let's talk about some of the more psychological effects of crisis, because I think that's where our faith can really be impacted during these times. So one of the ways is that we can have some difficulty thinking clearly. I'm sure you've experienced this. You may feel a little foggy. You may become distracted easily, which from a faith perspective makes Bible study kind of hard to do, right? Which kind of leads to another one of the effects of crisis, and that is being distracted with meaningless activities. We skip out on our daily faith habits and opt for things like scrolling on our phone or binge watching our favorite Netflix show. I know I have experienced this. I'm sure you can relate. The next effect is that we may begin to express feelings of anger and hostility, or a sense of numbness. Not exactly producing the fruit that we would see in the Christian life, am I right? And kind of going hand in hand with this, we see a lack of self-control and kind of this sense of impulsiveness. In this same vein, we can also fall into the trap of self-reliance. We can kind of depend more on ourselves to get the job done. We'll puff ourselves up and pretend that what we're going through isn't really all that bad and that we can get through it on our own. We believe that we have this ability to really save ourselves in the midst of this suffering. Now, none of these really sound like the objective in Christian suffering. Now, do they? They certainly don't sound sanctifying or faith-producing. They actually sound a little destructive, which is somewhat frustrating. And that's because they are. Oftentimes, in the midst of these crises, we find ourselves battling with our flesh, with our sinful nature to want to control everything around us, for us to think that we know better than God, and to just generally try to rely on ourselves or other things that just have no capacity to really support us in life. So, how can minimalism and a Christian faith really help us navigate these crises? So, the good news is that at any given time throughout the year, you are likely headed out of a crisis or headed into a crisis, but it doesn't have to be all bad news. So, if you are in one, then hang on tight to the Lord. He is your anchor in the storm, and He will give you your daily bread. So even if you find yourself having a difficult time carving out that perfect time in the morning to start your day with the Lord, maybe it looks like simply saying the Lord's Prayer while you're doing the dishes or driving in your car to drop your kids off at school. Maybe it's quickly just acknowledging that you feel like you don't have it in you to pray and ask God to be with you through that time. It's really in those small efforts that we can spend time with God daily, even if we don't want to, which is important to acknowledge too, that sometimes in the midst of these crises, we can find ourselves sort of wavering in our faith. My husband and I have kind of talked about this a lot lately with the number of crises that our family has experienced over the last several months. It's really easy to ask the question, why, or where is God in all of this? And it can really be a rubber meets the road kind of time for our faith. It's hard to believe that God is good when things don't feel like our definition of good. What helps us to redefine that definition and really understand the way that all things work together for the good of those who love God is really by getting into our Bibles and reminding ourselves of those truths daily, even when it's hard. Now, if you're coming out of a crisis, you better get into God's Word because the next one's not too far behind it. We can be tempted to feel like now we have some breathing room. We can start to relax our Bible study or our prayer a little bit because we don't feel that intense need like we do when we're in the midst of the crisis. But I would urge you, do not be fooled into complacency by comfort. The crisis is coming. The next challenge to our faith, to our family, to our homes is coming. Now is the time to put those deposits in your spiritual bank so that when they do come, you have a deep well to draw from. This is also the time to be those people. You've been through the crisis, so you can relate to those who are experiencing a little bit of that fogginess and need some assistance. Here's a little bonus tip. So if you are reluctant to sign up for meal trains because you never know what you should make or anything like that, I have a go-to recipe. I make this for, actually I have two. I make them for almost any meal train that I'm going to set up, and it is a modified version of the broccoli, rice, barbecue chicken casserole from Cook Once, Eat All Week, who I cannot remember the name of the author right now, but I'll put it in the description below. When I make that, I do a double batch. So I have dinner that night, and so does the family I'm taking dinner to. We both get dinner on the table. My kids get to see us and experience us serving someone else in need, and we have the joy of making life just a little bit easier for the people that we love. But wait, there's more. Think about your general stress level. If everything is just smooth sailing at your house, how do you feel? On a scale of my house is super clean, organized, and clutter-free, I take life in stride, and I can get all of my responsibilities met, to whose turn is it to roll the Jumanji dice? And side note, it's important that you watch the original, the Robin Williams one, not the new ones. They won't make as much sense about these analogies because that poor aunt in her house, whew, I feel like we've all been there. If your baseline at home is pretty high on the stress level, it's not going to take much to send your family into crisis. It's kind of like being a pot of simmering water on the stove. If it's just simmering, it doesn't take much to turn the heat up and crank it on up to a rolling boil, which is very different than starting with a pot of water that's at room temperature. It takes a lot more time for the temperature to really rise to get that boil going. So if you are not in the midst of the crisis, now is the time to turn down the temperature in your home. Don't declutter for your current self, declutter for your future self that knows that the storm is coming. And cling to the only rock that you know can weather the storms. I hope that you'll consider subscribing so that we can spend more time together. And if you'd like to watch the next video, you can click right up here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.